Good evening, everyone. I'm thankful to all of you for taking out time to attend this session. I shall begin with an overview of my talk and then explain each section in detail. During the talk, if you find anything unclear, please note it down and you can ask in the question and answer session at the end. I shall start with a brief self-introduction. I've done my BE and MPhil in electrical engineering and I've worked internationally both in the academic and industrial sectors. For students who intend to go into either sector, I shall try to summarize the lessons I learned from my experience and potential pitfalls to avoid. The topics covered in this talk include getting ready for applications, the application process, the interview, and what to do once you get an offer. At the end, I shall summarize the key points and will take questions from the audience. I now begin with the first step, getting ready for applications. This step can be broken down into four main parts. The first part is analyzing your own constraints, which includes evaluating what you can and cannot offer to a potential employer. Academic programs and some employers have a CTA requirement, so you need to be sure about the places you can target given your CTA. In the academic sector, your thesis, courses, projects, and publications are checked as well, so you can try to evaluate your standing based on these. You also need to think about whether you're willing to relocate to a city or country, or work in a place that requires a long daily commute. Some jobs require frequent traveling, so think about whether you'll be comfortable with that or not. This is important to consider for students who have commitments to their families or have other projects or hobbies going on. Some jobs expect you to work on weekends and public holidays, so you need to consider that as well. These points are important to consider, and sometimes spend thinking about these will ensure you don't waste your time going to places you don't fit into, and you don't end up quitting a job early on because of job dissatisfaction. Once you've analyzed your own constraints, you need to set some goals for yourself. You need to have some idea about what your priorities are, whether you're targeting a financially rewarding career regardless of the work conditions, whether you're after experience without much interest in the pay package, or whether you intend to work to advance your career in your field and move on to the next available opportunity. Based on these priorities, you can decide the type of places you should apply to. Please remember that in addition to a set of places you intend to apply to first, you also need to have some backup plans in case your primary goals are not achieved. This is because no matter how intelligent or hardworking you are, you all face failure at some time in your life. So it's better to be prepared for failure in advance. It's perfectly okay if you don't have any goals or backup plans. You want to work for a while to understand where you fit best. For me, my long-term goal has always been to be in a job in a teaching position. So early on in my career, I focused on getting research experience. I didn't care much about the remuneration. I worked as an RA for a while. I then moved to the industry to strengthen the financial side and worked for around 2 years in jobs that require extensive traveling on weekends, working on weekends and extensive travel. Eventually, I moved on to the academic sector and I've been working in it since. The third part is preparing for the application process. Once you have an idea about the places you intend to apply to, you can start shortlisting those. If you plan to go into research, save the links to university application websites and also the profile pages of your potential supervisors. Start making accounts on application portals, as this is a time-consuming process. Most importantly, remember to note down the required documents for each position and double-check whether you have those or need to obtain. This process of shortlisting keeps going on until you find a job, and potentially after that as well. Lastly, try to update your LinkedIn and personal website if you have one. Compile your documents and obtain certificates and transcripts, etc. Note that I haven't mentioned about updating the resume here. I shall explain in detail why later on. Now I shall explain the application process. Before applying, you need to carefully read the job description and requirements and prepare the required documents accordingly. For the resume, remember to avoid using the same resume for every application. Your resume needs to be tailored to highlight the requirements of the job you're applying for. For example, if the job requires you to work on machine learning, you can see which of these two resumes strongly conveys that the candidate is best suited for the job. The resume on the left shows irrelevant experience first and shows the main requirement at the end. It shows two things. First, that they didn't bother reading about the job description and set a generic resume. Second, that they might not be qualified for this job, since only one point has anything to do with the field of work. The resume on the right specifically presents what the employer wants to see. The expertise in the field of the employer's interest is presented early on and put in bold to catch their attention. So this resume has a higher chance of conveying that this is the right candidate for the job. Remember that you do not need to fill in every job experience, every internship, and every course you've taken in order to make your resume more powerful. Your first focus should be to present the experience most relevant to the job requirements. To quote a personal example of how adding irrelevant material to your resume can backfire, when I was applying for industrial jobs, I was suggested by someone to add my GRE and TOEFL scores to the resume, as they thought it would give a good impression. I went to an interview in the industrial sector, and the person taking the interview looked at the scores and straight up told that he doesn't expect that person who went through the trouble of taking these tests to last very long in the company. From there on, he asked casual questions in the interview, indicating clearly that he was not interested in hiring me. I tried to clarify that I was interested in an industrial job and would only pursue a higher degree after building strong finances, but he didn't listen. So this is one lesson I learned, that adding irrelevant information in the resume can actually harm you. Lastly, try to ensure that your resume is always accompanied by a cover letter. This gives you a chance to explain yourself in more detail to the employer. Instead of a brief email stating, "Please find attached my resume," if you put in time to write more about yourself in a cover letter, you have a better chance of getting called for an interview. I shall now explain the interview process. Once you get a call for an interview, go through your resume and ensure that you know everything you've mentioned in it. You can be asked to explain your projects, publications, or thesis, and you need to explain it very clearly. If you fail to explain your own work, it gives a very bad impression, and people are likely to assume that you didn't do it yourself. If you're being interviewed by a non-technical person or someone from another field, try to avoid using technical terminology as much as you can. Using field-specific terms in front of a person from a different field only shows that you don't understand your work well enough to explain it in simple terms. In the interview, you could be asked about your plans for the future and whether you're exploring other options. You need to be straightforward about these and tell them the truth. If you plan to switch in a couple of years, let them know. If you're awaiting better options, tell them. Once you're done with the interview, it's a good idea to follow up. You can send the interviewer an email the very same day expressing how it was a good experience talking to them and how you would like to join them soon. Sending any additional piece of information which can strengthen your application also helps. For example, you can send a piece of code on an article you wrote. This practice will show the interviewer that you're genuinely interested in the position and will make you stand out from the rest of the applicants. To share my own experience, when I was applying to HKUST, I sent a recent proposal to my supervisor after an initial discussion with them. They later mentioned to me that they were really impressed by this gesture, as it showed my interest in the position, as well as the ability to take initiative without being told to. Lastly, if you don't want to appear for the interview because you've got an offer from a better position, remember to let the institution know well in advance. If you stop replying or don't appear for the interview, it's not only unprofessional, but can have far-reaching consequences on your career as well. You'll likely be blacklisted from ever appearing to the particular institution. If you're working in a niche field, your other employer will eventually know about this unprofessional behavior by mutual contacts as well. The last step is getting the offer. Once you receive an offer, evaluate whether it is what was earlier advertised or not. Cross-check the details of the offer and make sure you understand the clauses before signing. If there's anything different from what you agreed to, make sure you let the contact person know and clarify. If you had earlier agreed to accept it, do not go back on your words. Apart from being unethical, this can be very damaging to your career elsewhere as well. If you decide to reject the offer, be courteous and preferably send a detailed email explaining your decision. It's professional, and you never know when you run into the concerned person later on. I shall now summarize the talk. I discussed that you need to know your own constraints well before applying. It is better to prepare early. Your resume needs to be targeted to the specific job. Your interview needs to be well rehearsed. You need to be honest in it and should try to follow up. When accepting or rejecting an offer, be courteous. In the end, I would like to thank Ms. Keena Wong from the HKUST ECE Alumni Association for giving me the opportunity to talk on this topic. I would like to express gratitude to Professor Andrew Kuhn, Professor Ross Mush, and the entire team at HKUST Department of ECE for arranging this talk. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I will now take questions.